I just felt like I had a moment, maybe over the course of a couple of months, where it was like, you got to decide. You got to decide which side of this you're going to be on. Are you going to be a recovery story and a testimonial, or are you going to be on this path, until you're 60, 70? There is no hiding this at this point.
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety and recovery from within Black and Brown communities. I'm really excited about the conversation today. The person that we're going to be having on as a guest is someone that I've been following for some time. She truly is a representation of wellness. And seems as though that she attacks it from so many different angles, and has her own very personal story with substance use, abuse, addiction, and her own recovery. So without further ado, I want to invite and thank Kristen Feemster for joining the Stacking Days podcast. Kristen, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I'm just really grateful to be here in this space with you and to get to talk on this level with you. I'm just really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I
Yeah.
mean, you kind of wear so many different hats between being a licensed therapist, a certified personal trainer, a wellness coach, an entrepreneur. I feel like you bring so much to this conversation, and we'll probably get into a lot of those aspects. But before we do, let's get right into your story, your journey with alcohol. For those who are listening, Kristen's in long-term sobriety. We touched on this a little bit before we started recording, and I feel like she's still very humble. So we're in for a treat. But let's go back to the beginning of your relationship with alcohol, and then we'll just kind of progress chronologically into your recovery from there. So where did it start for you, and you kind of what was your why?
So, context for me, I am from a very small town in South Carolina. Leading up to the role that alcohol had in my life, I think it's just the context of environment and the pressures that came with some of that environment that led to alcohol being an outlet. And so, anyway, grew up in a very small town. In South Carolina, upstate South Carolina. And I come from a family of athletes. So that is a part of just family lineage and pride, a source of pride, I guess you could say, for my family. And I myself was an athlete growing up. Um, Early ages, it was kind of just a thing, a thing to do. But as I got into middle school and high school, it became a thing where, hey, I actually might be actually like good with this, not just off of family foundation, but actually off of skill and that sort of thing. And so for me, that was my focal point, through late middle school, junior high, high school. That became like my main primary focus. And so alcohol was introduced into my life by way of being younger in high school and playing up on the varsity level team kind of gave me a little bit of exposure to drinking earlier than would naturally happen, maybe. But again, at that time, even I think my first drink might have been 14, maybe around there. But even
Hmm.
then, my career and aspirations as an athlete to play basketball, I was also a volleyball player, but basketball was becoming like the focal point. It kind of kept those things at bay. It was always secondary. It was always like, okay, yeah, but I'm focused on, my basketball aspirations, going to college, playing sports year round. And so although alcohol was a part of my story, it didn't get to a point where I would say it was a frequent concern until probably senior year, or not even a concern, but a frequent presence, I guess you could say,
Hmm.
senior year of high school, and going into college. There was always this element of needing to keep it under control so that I could be perfect. That's essentially what the struggle was for me. I had a lot of pressure to be a good student, a lot of pressure to be an excellent basketball player, and the fear of those things being shaken by anything kind of kept thing too crazy from becoming something that I would venture into. So a lot of my friends would probably say I was like the mom of the group, like, yeah, Kristen will drink, but she's not going to go too far. Or, I was always that one that was concerned with how things looked, how they would affect me, who would find out about it, and what it looked like, and ultimately, mhm,
No, I was gonna say, where do you think that came from? Was that because I've also been in a position where I've, battled with battled expectation, and
mhm.
and some of that certainly was, external expectations, but some of it was self-manufactured. And so I'm curious, where did you feel that pressure from? Was it in fact coming from family and friends and externally, or was it your own personal anxieties around trying to live up to an expectation that you've created for yourself?
I really think it was a mixture of both. And I think that growing up in the community that I grew up in is predominantly white. Black population is very small. And so I think just as a Black person in general, there's always that undercurrent of, feeling like you have to be twice as good to kind of meet average with your peers just by way
Yeah.
of misconception and racism. And so although I didn't have that language, it was very much so one of those types of environments, culturally speaking, and with the community of and there was some outside perception of that too, of being, a very well spoken, a well put together Black girl from a middle class family, and being one of the smarter students in the classroom. And then she's athletic too. It became, the appearance of it and the expectation of me, combined with me realizing that if I could just do this how people expect me to, then I don't have to worry about being rejected or, being found out or, being seen as a failure. I think they both kind of came together. So it was a
Mhm.
way of keeping myself safe, but also a way of showing up in to get approval from other people and to feel better. That's been a work to uncover and
Yeah.
unpack even in long-term sobriety. But I do think even as like 6, 7, 8 years old, I think that worry about not being accepted or not being good enough started to come in. And then what you do is you find a talent and it just kind of you just go with it and you pursue it by any means necessary. And that's kind of where I was at.
Yeah. No, that makes
Hmm.
sense. I mean, safety is certainly a really powerful word, particularly for folks of color who, oftentimes struggle to find that safety. Certainly physical safety, and then also emotional and mental safety. So, and it starts young, and it is challenging, particularly in environments where you are one of the only in the environment. Um, so talk to me a little bit about that transition from high school into college then for you, and that shift of environment, probably people as well, and then your own development and your own journey.
Yeah, so coming from high school to college was a new world for me. I went to another small town in Western North Carolina. I went to Western Carolina University to play basketball, but it was another small town. So some of the dynamics were the same, but it was college, and I was an athlete. So my world, my bubble within that environment was much more diverse, to a point where I felt like I had a new chance to kind of create the narrative around who I was. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
growing up in a small town where everybody, is familiar with your family, you kind of get locked in. It's like there's unspoken expectation. It kind of just is the way it is. And then going into college, I found that I was able to create my own image for myself. And so I really genuinely had a great time, in college. I wouldn't say that alcohol use increased in that time, of course, as far as being in an environment where those expectations were less and just more freedom. But I didn't use it later on towards the end of my college days is when I began to use it as a crutch and use it as a
Mm.
coping mechanism. But I can speak to more parties, more fun, more all the things that come with college definitely led to me experimenting with alcohol way more, frequently than I had before. But again, my focus was playing basketball, getting good grades, like that image and that those high expectations and standards that I had for myself still overrode, the drinking and what it looked like. I was still very paranoid and had needed a sense of control, which in hindsight, I can see that the need for feeling like I needed to find control was maybe the first indicators that there is some sort of relationship that could potentially get out of control if I don't manage it. I think that that was probably one of the first like really small signs. Um, but as I went through college, really enjoyed my career playing basketball. Alcohol began to have a more present role my senior year. This is when I had some experiences that were making it hard for me to show up
Mm,
with this facade and this appearance of perfection. And I don't want to say facade in that I was, trying to put on. It just felt like I had no choice at times, but to be who people expected me to be. But the summer before my senior year, I experienced a loss that was indirect to my life, but also still very close. So I was going through grief. I had gotten my heart broken for the first
mm,
time in my adult world in a relationship and struggling with what was going to be next for me. A lot of uncertainty, and a lot of emotional changes that I hadn't experienced at that level. And so that is when I started to drink more. And it wasn't just because there was a party that weekend. And it wasn't just because it was start to be at maybe odd times throughout the week or for a particular purpose, And I
mm.
always say now, any moment where I could have like taken deep breaths or prayed or done some sort of grounding technique, I was venturing into using alcohol in those moments. So people can use their imagination for what that looked like, but it was kind of serving that purpose towards the end of college for me.
You know, sounds like you were certainly dealing with some big life moments, in that time. And I feel like hindsight's always 2020 when you are coming are you when you're on the other side of this thing and you're kind of looking back at the course of your life and moments in time where you're making that decision to drink as opposed to, praying or drinking as opposed to, doing whatever the case may be, that's
Mhm.
probably more positive for you. But in the moment, it doesn't seem like you're on the wrong path, right? It's a progressively, negative slippery slope
Mhm.
that unfortunately you don't recognize until you're much further down that path. So meaning that was kind of like the behavioral changeover for you, what did the next couple years look like? And then at what point in time did you recognize for yourself that this in fact is actually becoming a problem for me? And it's no longer what it was, in my earlier experiences with the substance.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And I just want to echo what you said as far as these moments seeming harmless at the time. This is all
Yeah.
very much so a hindsight thing of how I was using and relating to alcohol at that time. And I so senior year graduated. I think that that was probably a pivotal moment was graduating from undergrad where a lot of things just kind of stopped at that point. So up until this time period, I had my academics and my sports involvement as a focal point of identity and purpose and drive. And
Mhm.
then upon graduation, basketball ended, grades, achievement in that academic realm were no longer, as big of a deal. I did go on to grad school, but basically at that time, it was very pivotal in what I saw as purposeful for myself, what I had rooted my identity in up until that point. And so that is where I noticed a significant shift in just from a logistics standpoint, having more time on my hands, but also having less direction and less sense of purpose. And so you combine those things with alcohol, which is always available,
Yeah.
relieves the pressure, gives you that boost of confidence and all the feel goods, at least temporarily speaking, that it gives to you, it began to be, more of a daily thing that I would do. And a lot of times I talk with my clients or just in any environment about how your tolerance starts to grow with
Mhm.
addiction. And so what used to maybe be a drink a day becomes two drinks a day. And then after that, then now it's three drinks a day and maybe five on that one day where you're really, whatever the numbers are, but there's a gradual tolerance building that happens. And so what used to be a couple of days a week went to almost every day. And then what was a little bit every day went to two, three, four times that every day based on tolerance and based on uh, working towards investing in something that wasn't necessarily helping me. So the more depressed I get, the more I'm drinking, but then that's not helping me. So now I'm more depressed and I'm drinking more. It's just like the chicken or the egg
Yeah.
type of thing. And I went like that for, let's see, so that's probably age 22, I would say, graduating. For the next 4 years, it just kind of became that type of cycle, Again, to your point earlier, never really catching the harm in real time because the way
Yeah.
tolerance builds and the way you get used to a new baseline is very subtle. And so what five drinks would have done a year ago, now it's like, oh, okay, well, I just poured a big one. I just poured
Yeah.
a big pour, or I would get these diva glasses of wine instead of the small ones. And so to me, in my head, of course, addiction at play. I'm thinking, well, I've only had one glass of wine, and it's like, yeah, but that's a at the time, I don't know if it's still a thing. I feel so old with this, but a diva glass was like those big like ones that women would watch Scandal and drink, like these big. I mean, it was probably half a
I
bottle.
seen him, yeah. I
Yeah.
seen him. Very,
So
very efficient if you wanna down a bunch of wine.
exactly, but in your mind, it's been rationalized as just being one, you
Yeah.
know. And so life starts to happen, and I think the gap between how I felt internally and where my life was going continued to space out to where I
Mm.
felt even more like an imposter and even more like the appearance of what people thought, because I've always, had a thing for fitness, I've always looked a certain way in some regards, and so people would not suspect, that life has fallen apart behind the scenes. And so that gap kept the pressure there, and the pressure generated more drinking to show up and seem like nothing was wrong as opposed to facing the fact that my drinking was getting out of control. And so I think that, I mean, there's war stories and there's all kinds of things, of course, that we could go into, but that was really the last 2, 3 years of my drinking was just more of life happening, me not coping with it, and me drinking over it, and thus causing more despair, more issues, and more isolation in my
Yeah.
drinking as well.
Yeah. Isolation, that's a heavy word, and I know that very well. We talk a lot about coping mechanisms, and I'm sure that you have much more healthy coping mechanisms today than you did, 10, 12 years ago. But I'd love to learn about a little bit more about that tension for you in that time of your life, right? So you're starting to recognize that the drinking is becoming problematic, but you're also trying to show up, in a very specific way. And I'm sure that there was probably like a 24-hour cycle where, if you're anything like me, you're drinking, the next day starts, and you're kind of ramping yourself back up into your high productivity, and then ramping yourself back down in the evening to medicate and cope with the day and life. I'd love to learn a little bit more from you about what that tension looked like in your life at the time, and then ultimately, how did you transition to the past that point of tension to start addressing the issue as opposed to succumbing to it entirely?
There was a lot of work that went into managing how how much time and effort and physical, energy was going into drinking. And so, yeah, what started out in hindsight, I can see where there was probably never towards the end. Now, of course, there's control, and then you gradually lose the control to where I can kind of say now that I don't think I had many sober moments towards the end of my drinking. Now, was I drinking intentionally at 7 a.m.? No, but if I just stop drinking at midnight, I'm probably not completely sober by 7. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm still under the influence of something. And so I was unwell a lot of the time, just trying to make it through. I can't name, luckily, no significant health issues, but I do feel like some of that was on the horizon just because my tolerance had grown to a point where I really don't feel like my body really had time to like fully detox and flush out, you
Yeah.
know, the alcohol that I would consume, say, over the weekend, and then somehow work it to get it together on Monday during the day. But by Monday night, we're back in the swing. And gradually, there were times, of unemployment, between jobs, I guess you could say, where I was a daytime drinker because every day was a Saturday,
Yeah.
and so that those types of things are a part of my story as well, of losing control over the socially acceptable times. And I'm using air quotes on that because I think that kind of, there's a lot of binge drinking that's encouraged in our society, but even venturing outside of those, drinking earlier in the day, later into the night, to where the gap of sobriety allegedly is like very, very small, you know.
Hmm.
Um, and so it was a struggle. I mean, I look back now and I'm like, I don't know how I was making it through. But the pressure and the pride sometimes can be so strong that it'll make you find a way to do something that doesn't have to be as hard as you're making it. And so,
Yeah.
you know, loading up on Pedialyte to hydrate from this. I mean, there's just a lot of different things that I tried to do to seem okay until those things no longer worked.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I hear that, I feel that, and,
Mhm.
we spend so much time trying to handle it and so much
Mhm.
time trying to
Mhm.
manage it as opposed to
Mhm.
dealing with it, right? And, so it sounds as though that you've come to this crescendo now where it's starting to become unmanageable, right? You
Mhm.
don't have a handle on it the way that you once did. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stacknday's.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. What and where did you dig into in order to step in a new direction for yourself? What was there a moment, was there an
Mhm.
event that kind of, tipped the scale for you, or was it just a silent kind of recognition that you needed to move in a different direction?
There was a silent recognition, probably about a year before I got sober. There was some work I was trying to do within myself. There was some online forums and some different things. By this point, my family, was well aware of what was going on. And I think that's a part of, what helped me too, is that the fear is that I'm going to be found out, and that what are people going to think, and how am I going to get to what I need to without anybody knowing. And so I think in a divine way, although, people confronting you on your drinking isn't necessarily what you want to hear, it was an opportunity for me to realize there is no secret here. You know what I mean? Like, it
Yeah.
would be okay if I were to say yes to their question of, have you been drinking, or do you feel like it's a problem? Because there's already that door that's been opened just by way of them expressing concern. And so that started to happen the last year. But I also had my own personal moments, my own dark moments. I think, you know, again, the facade of control was present. And then very quickly, as all of my habits around it started to get worse, the reality of harming somebody or harming myself or not feeling in control of my thoughts and having suicidal ideation and, depression, getting to a point where I was really afraid of like what the next step was going to be or what was going to happen next. And ultimately just reaching consequences and rock bottoms that I knew I didn't want to deal with, couldn't face, couldn't fathom having to walk through,
Hmm.
harming someone else because I'm driving to the store to pick up, another drink, or, coming back from a social gathering having only had one or two in front of people, but knowing that I've already had a couple before, and just knowing I was further along, the intoxication than I let on. Those types of moments started to scare me, and this is where I kind of feel like things were a bit more divine and out of my control because I got sober young at the age of 26. So I feel like I'm so lucky. I'm like, how did all of this line up? But it
Yeah.
was just these moments of you can either go left or right now. You know, you're seeing how the stars are aligning with the track that you're going on now. And addiction, unfortunately, runs in my family, so I do have knowledge of what that looks like decades down the line.
Hmm.
So it's like you can either go left or you can go right. Your moment of the last bit of control and before these other things start to pile on, I just felt like I had a moment maybe over the a course of a couple of months where it was like you got to decide which side of this you're going to be on. Are you going to be a recovery story and a testimonial, or are you going to be on this path, until you're 60, 70? And either what I've come to know is a lot of people in my family had drank themselves out of it, like at an old age or aged out to where they just
Hmm.
couldn't
Hmm.
actually do it anymore. Or they continued until, some other health issue came up. And so I had a very clear understanding of that being the choice. And that combined with some low moments of I can't show up anymore and not like this is going to there is no hiding this at this point, there is
Yep.
or that my time of hiding it was getting very, very short. And so I had a conversation. There were some things that happened, again, personal things that happened over the course of a couple of days before I got sober. And I just reached out to my mom and told her that, I'm going to go to my first 12-step meeting. I asked her to go with me because I was afraid and nervous to go. But it was because
Good
of,
for you.
yeah, thank you. It was because of conversations. It was because of her making it a safe space that I was able to say that out loud to her,
Yep.
So I think in anybody who's listening to, how do you help someone who has a drinking problem or what do you do? I think knowing that there were times where my mom had mentioned or said something in a loving, compassionate way that let that door be opened for when I was ready. It wasn't accusatory, it wasn't fear based, it wasn't, aggressive in any way. It was just a knowing and a presence, and I'm here. And so when I was ready, that was someone that I felt like I could reach out to. And there were some other people, I used my mom, but there were some other people close to me that had created that safe space as well for me to take those first steps. To take those first steps. And a lot of this, I think, is God at work, that it all came together for me to be ready, for my support system to be open arms, and for just things to align for me to get it together.
Yeah, I love that. And the reason why I say good for you is because all those signs can be present, and sometimes it's really difficult when you're in the grips of addiction to grasp them and hold on to them as a source of strength, as opposed to something that is stoking the shame and guilt that you're feeling within yourself. So just that action of stepping towards the compassion sometimes is challenging, even though it may be coming from your very close loved ones or friends. It's easy for the addicted mind to misconstrue it as being as needing to be on the defensive, right, and needing to protect yourself as opposed to stepping into authentic support. So I mean that's where
Mhm.
where I think it's important to note. And I love the fact that you've highlighted the space that needs to be created for people who are struggling, because you need that not judgment space. You need that true, compassion, and you have to feel it, past just the words itself. And it sounds like that's what you were feeling, by way of your family and some of the other folks who were close to you at the time.
And I do want to say too, Ray, with what you just said around the defensiveness that can come. I believe, if I'm remembering everything correctly, that same weekend I had a moment of defensiveness that
Mhm.
happened, where my mom had reached out and mentioned some things she had seen, and I got defensive and I got angry, and yes, that was one of the signs that let me know, okay, this is out of control now, because
Yeah.
I'm the fun drunk. I'm the one that, it's the party. It's the outgoing part of my personality. It's the fun. It's the tailgate. It's the this. It was like all these pictures I had of what my drinking was supposed to be. I was realizing it's no longer that anymore. Now I'm depressed and in a dark space, and I'm getting defensive with the one person who genuinely is just trying to help me,
Yeah.
and I know that, but there's something that's taking over me that's not making it possible for me to receive it. And so, to your point, that did happen one time, and I think that was a big catalyst for, okay, this is, I can see this, because if I'm defending something that I know is true with someone who I know loves me unconditionally, wouldn't care what I said back to them, then that lets me know I've completely lost control, and I'm on the slope is as slippery as it can get if I don't do something now. And so I did have that one moment, but thank God it was that one moment, and I was able to use that as like a low bottom moment, emotionally speaking, to
Yeah.
make the changes soon thereafter.
I think that's a great call out, because oftentimes folks are, who are sitting there who maybe haven't stepped into recovery, haven't stepped into support, are asking themselves, do I have a problem? Whether they're Googling it or, they maybe just be socializing the idea in their mind. And I do think that that is something that oftentimes is overlooked is,
Hmm.
whether or not you are starting to become defensive about these decisions that you're making for yourself that are clearly, doing more harm for you and the folks around you than they are good, but you're still holding on to this, false sense of pride. I think that's a clear call out that you might want to take a closer look at your relationship.
Absolutely. Fighting for something that's killing you is a big,
There
major
you
red
go.
flag. Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pull that one out and
Right.
make it a make it a real.
use that one. Post that one, Ray. Post that
Yeah,
one.
exactly. Oh man, so now you're walking into the rooms for the first time. You're with your mother, who I'm assuming has never walked into a room on her own before.
Well,
Um,
she dropped me
or
off. It was a closed meeting, but she did drive me
okay,
to the actual meeting. She came with me,
and she picked
and
you up.
and she stayed until I was done. Hmm.
So so let's talk about what that initial moment looked like for you. That's a legitimate step in a different direction. And I know that for folks of color, the jury is oftentimes out on whether or not AA is supportive, in terms of, folks of color. But what was your experience like? Because just in hearing you recount your journey on other platforms, I know that that was a focal part of your healing process. So what does that look like for you now? Stepping into this space that's curated for your healing.
Yeah, I started out in 12 step by sheer just accessibility, and feeling like, I think in an element of feeling like something I could control. I can kind of go and come and try it out. It wasn't treatment, it wasn't rehab, which I think is a privilege. Sometimes I'm like, I wish I could have gone and just, had a full break, because I feel like I was like organizing a rehab for myself. But
Mm,
I at that moment where I was completely broken and didn't know where else to go, I was fully surrendered to whatever was going to help me. I didn't have any pushback. And so when I went to a 12 step meeting, I just went with it. It's like, what do I have to lose here?
yeah,
There's definitely some experiences as a Black woman in 12 step meetings that was absolutely there from the beginning, by way of remaining anonymous when you are the only one
yeah,
of a couple of Black people in the room. And I'm 5'11", almost 6 foot, big fro, walking in the room. There is no anonymity. When I walk into
yeah.
the room that I was in, I stuck out, and so I think that was hard from day one. I had a lot of conversations with, my sponsor, who was very helpful in the ways that she could, but she, was a white woman, and so couldn't quite understand why like physically opening the door and walking into
Hmm.
to a 12 step meeting was hard for me for like 4 or 5 months probably. Like just the act of going into the
Which
room.
is a critical window of time, right, for someone in early sobriety to not only deal with the issue at hand, but also the discomfort and pressures that come along with the structured setting that you've decided to involve yourself in to deal with the issues at hand, which I think is like the double, it's like the double-edged sword there.
Yeah, yeah, it's
But you push through it.
I pushed through it. Yeah, it's kind of one of those you can have a moment of gratitude and understand that things weren't perfect at the same time, and I think that's one of those
Yeah.
things where I was grateful to have somewhere to go every day, and there were positive aspects of it, but I can't not acknowledge that that was a part of a struggle for me as well. Again, I think some of it was real, based on what we talked about, but also, again, remember my story is perfection, and
Yeah.
how things look. And so going in with that humility of I need to be here every day, actually, you know what I mean, and having to face that every single day for me, as somebody who has always seemed to have it together and there's nothing wrong with you, and you just, that sort of thing, walking into the door was was having me come up, against that truth as well, which is I do need help, and I'm not perfect, and that's okay. And I can, come in my weakest moments and talk about what I'm going through. So I think it was a bit of both. You know what I'm saying? As far as would
Yeah.
that have been more helpful to do with people who look like me? I think so, but I still would have probably had to get over some of the pride, and embarrassment that came with just getting help, in
No,
general. Yeah. So
totally.
so I was all in. I was all in for the program. I did in my overachieving, high achieving ways. I did more than what was asked, probably, just I really felt like nobody told me I had to do a meeting every day, but I subscribed to that. I just went for a meeting every day for the first 90 days, which some people were being recommended, but that wasn't personally, a requirement for me or anything like that, or strongly suggested in any sort of way. And took a year off from relationships,
Mm.
as is generally recommended. That was necessary for me. I took some extra time after my year was up just to make sure, because, dealing with heartbreak and insecurities around relationships was a big trigger for me. If a
Mhm.
relationship didn't work out, I would drink over it. I mean, I was drinking over everything, but in particular, I was drinking over my grief and loss around relationships and feeling abandoned and rejected and that sort of thing. Um, and I, followed that process for. I was in AA for. So I got sober 2014. I would say all the way up until when COVID hit, I was still somewhat in the rooms, maybe not at the
Mhm.
frequency, but I had a home group and I attended that regularly and found my way. I found meetings that were a little bit more diverse, or at least a little younger, or sometimes just as we have to as people of color, sometimes you just don't get to choose. Sometimes we
Yeah.
have to go to work. We have to go to
Yeah.
work. We have to be in these meetings. We have to do things and be the only one. And it's unfortunate, but I did kind of use that as a way of continuing in the program at a time where I was kind of starting to think, for this to be sustainable, I'm going to have to find some different aspects of this to really make it lifelong. And
Yeah.
so,
I mean, I think that makes sense, and I think that one of the beauties that come, the beautiful things that come with being sober, being in recovery, is you have the clarity of mind to recognize when you need to tweak things to your betterment, right? And because that is something that doesn't necessarily exist when you're in active usage. You're kind of in neutral, going wherever the wind is pushing you. Whereas when you're in recovery, you very much are in the driver's seat. You've made really, really hard decisions to be in the driver's seat. So I am curious within that, you say from 2014 to 2020, what did you start doing differently, coming into probably one of the most challenging windows historically, for individuals in this country at that point in time to maintain the path that you were on, where for a lot of people, that was the point where, their mental health struggled. People struggled with that. So what did that look like for you, and what are some of the changes that you made that ultimately became kind of cornerstone coping mechanisms for you?
One, I began to honor that although 12 step was giving me something, that I started to honor the parts of me that would be triggered by certain spaces within 12 steps. So in particular, there was a moment where, like, I've said there's always been this element of feeling not quite as comfortable as I would want to be, but also knowing that I needed to, have an element of surrender in my recovery in general. And so as I got my pride and ego and my insecurities more um, under control and soothed, I guess you could say, the discomfort that I felt around, how do I feel in this space actually? Like there's no insecurity that's rooted in it. It's just how am I feeling in this environment? And there was a point in time where I felt particularly triggered in the room.
Mhm.
It was something political had just happened. This is when Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are running for the presidency. And so there was just a lot that had happened that day. Something had happened, and I was about to go to a meeting like I always do. And I just honored that I just need a safer space. Like, I need a space where the conversations about the political climate and, things that are going on in our communities is more open, because in 12 step, it's very much so to the premise of alcoholism, not drinking just for today, stories, support. There's really no outside conversations. And I can understand the reasons why, but I needed more within that.
Yep.
So when fast forward when COVID hit and the pandemic and everything went online, my the recovery world that I knew went from not just being, these couple of churches down the road to anywhere in the United States and in the world. So to me, I'm
Yep.
like, wow, this is a new realm of, I wonder who's in California getting sober. I'm thinking about like this bigger picture. And so that was where I started to see that because of all that was going on there was more of a focus on diverse and inclusive recovery spaces for the meeting that I went to was for women of color
Mhm.
through a platform called She Recovers. They had a Facebook group and they had a meeting every Saturday. And that was my first, introduction. I remember the first meeting of that. It was on Zoom because, everything was the pandemic at that time. And there was probably I want to say 100. It was an overwhelming amount of little Zoom icons with just little black and brown faces. And I was like, oh
It's awesome.
my goodness, like this is never had seen that before. And I know we're virtual, but it was just so crazy to see all of these black and brown women showing up at their level of recovery. And so I get how if you're not connected at all, it could be hard to find those spaces and know how to move through. But because I think I had some time under my belt, me going into finding what I was looking for was a little bit easier because I knew what I was looking for. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And so yeah, at that time I was like, wow, this is opening up my recovery to have me think about what really is going to help me, go the course of life with the support that I actually need. And there's some other platforms that have come out. This is when I start connecting with sober influencers through hashtags. I would search sober black women on
Mhm.
Instagram and try to search for people and would find people because we were all online trying to find what in the world we were
Each
going to
other.
do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So then where do you start making the transition from someone who's doing a lot of the internal work, which sounds like and I feel like we were constantly doing the internal work, but when did you make that transition to then becoming a therapist and a trainer and a wellness coach and like leaning into pouring all that you've gathered and into others and their journeys, some of which I assume are people who are on similar journeys and some of which maybe you're not. But where
Hmm.
did that shift start happening for you?
Well, I think what I'm able to do now is kind of a testament to that crossroad that I told you I was at when I first got sober. Is that at that point, when I got sober, I was already working as a mental health professional. I was
Okay.
already had the history of being an athlete and was doing fitness for myself. Sometimes I would go to the gym and I was not completely sober, but I was still trying, you know what I mean? It's just a weird time in my life, but those elements of what I was truly passionate about and what really was helpful or purposeful were there. It was just that alcohol couldn't go with me to get to those
Hmm.
things and live those things out fully. And so, as I've stayed sober, it's more so been about allowing my personal journey of recovery to be a part of what I was already, involved in and putting out into the world. So, I was very protective over that for the first couple of years because I don't ever want to get to a situation where I'm uh, capitalizing off of a story that's very real in a way
Yep.
that's inauthentic, just to make money or just to have a partnership or just to have, popularity. I'm like, no, this is real life. Like this has got to
Yeah.
last me until I'm 100. So I don't want to play with it. So I very much so protected it early on. And then after a while of being sober, all the shame started to leave and the embarrassment. And I'm like, wait a minute, now this is a miracle. Somebody needs to know about this. Like it became more of something to be proud of and that I wanted to share with the world. And so there was just a day on my social media. This is before, things had kind of grown to where they are now, where I just shared, a milestone, I think, of a couple of years, or it was something in particular. Maybe it was when I hit 1,000 days, I think is
Mhm.
when I shared. And from that point on, I've allowed my purpose to be a little bit more about being who I needed to see. If everybody keeps it to themselves and everybody has their own relationship with how they share their recovery, but I felt very strongly that even earlier on in this first couple of months, I felt a calling to using my story in a different way to touch people in a bigger, more public way. So the work I do now is just a method of getting one of allowing me to be at my whole self when I show up. Like when I
Mm.
show up as a trainer and a coach, when I show up as a therapist, most people know that that's a part of my story. It doesn't have to come up, but they know that's a frame of reference for how I'm helping them. And sometimes people will reach out to me because I'm sober, and so it's just really enhanced the work that I do now. And outside of it just being about not drinking alcohol, I realized that the foundation of recovery is something for everybody. Your mental health, your physical health, your coping skills, your boundaries, your lifestyle, your routine. It doesn't matter what the vice is. We're all pretty much probably dealing with some sort of vice on some level. And we could all use these principles. I found them through my addiction to alcohol, but you could find them through your relationship with food that needs to improve, or you could find them through some traumas that you've been through that you're recovering from. We all need these principles. And so that's what I try to put out now is unlearning unhealthy habits and building a sustainable routine. And I don't pursue or promote fitness as a way of, weight loss because that's not why I do it. I do it as a way of keeping myself sober and sane
Yep.
and well. And so that's the way that I want to promote it because that's the most sustainable way to look at it. And so that's kind of how all of these things got embodied in what I put out into the world.
No, I love it. I mean, I think when folks, are watching you in this like social media setting, and fitness is clearly something that you're promoting, mental health is clearly something that you're promoting, as also just being a part of like your day to day, right? Like as you said, these are some of the things that you do in order to stay sober. What are some of the other resources that you specifically use to in your recovery process, and what of those resources do you then carry over into your client work, to support folks who may have also been in their own journey of substance use and now recovery, or maybe have never had an issue with substances but recognizing that we are all kind of struggling with something.
Hmm. Hmm. Like you, I, love to connect and follow along with different podcasts and different stories about recovery. I think that even if you don't have access to healthcare and treatment around your addiction, I think that there are free platforms and resources. Social media, I think, even more so now, is a great um, resource, and I use it now. I could see. I appreciate it now. And I wonder what it would have looked like if I could have found those things earlier on, just how
Mm.
pivotal it would have been. But I think social media is a great way to introduce yourself to different lifestyles, and the sober curious movement and the sober October and just different things that you may not have even thought of. Whereas my thought, and it is what it is, but it was like AA was kind of like the only, that was kind of where my head was at the time. So
Sure.
I definitely think that connection, and not feeling alone on whatever level. I think there's a level of community, that I've always kept, even though the type of recovery support changes, the element of community with people. There are women that I've known since day one, day two, day three that I still am in connection with. And surprisingly, like we call it the class of 2014, where we like all were getting sober in 2014, and we're all 9, 10 years sober now. And so those are my girls. That's a community. That's not a 12-step meeting. That's not a, meeting at 5 p.m. on Wednesdays type group, but that is my support. I also find, of course, all the health stuff that I talk about. Fitness is absolutely a great, or just physical activity in general. I think fitness sometimes can kind of be a loaded word, but
Yeah.
staying active, getting outside, moving your body, nourishing your body well. Those are things that, of course, I promote, and I genuinely think that those have made a difference in the way that I'm able to think clearly, treat my body well so that I can manage things well when they get stressful. My sleep schedule, all those things play in. I also think that there's an element of outside of support, sober support. I think that being able to be honest with people that are in your life, I think is important as
Mhm.
well. And so for me, I've had such, and shout out to everybody, I've had such a supportive support system of people who are not sober people, just my friends who've been like,
Mhm.
I hear you. I want to support whatever goals you have. Some people have to cut their friends off. They have to cut off they
Yeah.
have to change jobs. They have to, and so, whatever that looks like, I think creating that supportive environment. Again, recovery support is helpful, but I think when I think of sustainable long term recovery, it has to kind of venture into my friendships and my family relationships and my coworkers. Like it has to kind of be more embodied at that point. It can't be as compartmentalized because life goes on,
Yeah.
and you may not always be
Yeah.
able to get there. And so, community, education, do a lot of educating around the signs of drinking. I've posted on my page about the different, like what actual drink sizes look like, because, like we said
Mhm.
before, a glass of wine isn't a whole lot. Okay, it's like you think
Yeah.
it's really not as much as
Couple
you.
ounces.
Yeah, yeah. So when most people think, they're like, oh, I would have never thought I had a drinking problem or was binge drinking. But now when I see where the shot glass is actually supposed to stop, or I actually see what counts as one drink, now I'm more educated on, maybe I do need to kind of look at this, and that along with the different signs. So I think education is a big component of that too. And then lastly, I'll say a spiritual walk of some sort.
Mhm.
I'm a big advocate for that. As a therapist, it doesn't matter to me what it looks like. I just know that element of having faith and understanding things outside of yourself is essential. And so I try to, support people in wherever they are with that. And I'm not promoting one religion or one, practice over another, but there's got to be something, that you can turn
Mhm.
to when you're at the end of yourself. And so my hope is that everybody finds that no matter what they're struggling with.
Yeah, super powerful. And certainly when we talk about that word safety, that is a space where you can start to feel that safety, because it almost lives outside of the human realm, right?
Hmm.
That divinity, that spirituality. You mentioned a few resources. I want to include them. So when you talk about communities of women, I don't know if there's a centralized place that you've found these women, or they've kind of just stepped into your life from all walks. But what resources would you suggest for, Black women, women of color who are out there, who are looking for community, who are looking for connection, but maybe don't know the first place to turn?
When it comes to addiction, substance use issues in particular, I would say She Recovers they have a lot of different recovery resources. I don't even think they are just to substance use. They also do some eating disorder recovery and some trauma
Okay.
recovery type groups. But I do know that they have a specific Facebook group that I'm actually a part of, that hosts meetings for women of color in particular. And so that is a free group. Don't quote me on this, you guys, but it is every other Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so I think that's been a great resource for me to have, as well as other people who are just trying to find a place to start, completely virtual. So that She Recovers, and then there is a specific Facebook group for women of color only, although they have other stuff.
Okay.
Sober Black Girls Club is another organization that is making waves, and they are based out of North New York, I believe, but they also have different pods of, like, I guess you could say, like, chapters, or something, like,
Right.
of in some other larger cities, but they have virtual meetings as well. I would say my community, the B3 community, we are women of all walks of life really come in to my community, some of which they are addressing a relationship with alcohol, but I've also opened that up to any vice, any issues. So I also have a lot of people in my specific community that are dealing with disordered eating types of
Mhm.
situations that also kind of mimic that, relationship with alcohol. But again, any recovery process is welcome, and again, recovery is for everyone. And so that is kind of the foundation of the community that I offer through B3.
I love that.
Hmm.
Well, I'll make sure to include all those links that you just mentioned in the show notes for folks. Um, for folks who are listening to this, and they're early on in their conversation with themselves, and they're trying to identify their relationship with alcohol. They might have identified that they have a problem with it, but they don't necessarily know the first step to take in addressing the issue. As someone who's been through it, and also as a professional, what word of advice would you give to that individual?
Personally, I would say that just from one person to another, if you are wrestling with whether your relationship with alcohol or any substance is serving you or not, um, it's time to address it. I think we get so caught up with the wrestling, like, is it not? I need to think about it a little bit more. Let me try this, let me try that, instead of just going all in and just see. Nothing is set in stone. I spent so much time trying to figure out if I could manage my drinks by only drinking beer, because I only drink beer. I don't drink liquor. So that means that I'm this, or,
Right.
trying to find ways to categorize it. And a year went by trying to do that, and all the
Yeah.
while the actual issue is getting worse by way of beer sometimes, and wine sometimes, and liquor sometimes. But I was so caught up in trying to figure out if it was or if it wasn't, that I wasn't realizing that if it's bothering you, then that's enough. Like, there's no real,
Yeah.
like, set requirements. And I think that is what hangs most people up for months, years, is, well, I wasn't sure and I had to figure out, and then it got better and then it got worse. And it's like, if there's something that is knocking on you to be addressed, answer the call and just see what can happen. And then also in that same grain of, the hardest thing is asking for help, but the
Yeah.
easiest thing to do is to get help. And personally, that was the easiest thing for me to do. Professionally, I would say the same. As a therapist, um, it's hard to not to feel judged. I can get that when you're sharing your story, but therapists are in the field of helping people because we want to help people, and so know that when you're reaching out to pursue therapy, that the person that you're reaching out to wants to help you, and so don't let that shame or that fear keep you from, allowing somebody to come in, And I guess essentially what I'll say is that you don't have to have all the answers right here, right now. You know, you just got to take that one step of let me just take a break from drinking and just see what happens. That could be your one step. Or it could be, let me just throw out a few inquiries to some therapists just to see who would be able to start working with me and then go from there. Let me follow a few sober influencer accounts just to see what the lifestyle is like without having to think, well, how bad is it? How old am I? Well, could I not drink at this wedding I have coming up? And what happens if all these thoughts when you could just
Yeah.
get into some sort of action? And so
Yeah.
that's what I would say. Take a step. Take a step.
I love that. And get curious. It's like it's there's nothing wrong with exploration.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong. And I've had enough conversations with enough folks at this point to also realize that if you think you have it under control, chances are you probably don't.
Right.
And to your point, if you have that nagging, if you're having that nagging conversation with yourself, give yourself the gift of stepping in a new direction. And I think that a lot of the points that you just mentioned are super super valuable. So thank you for that. Um, the last question that I have, and the reason that I ask this question to most guests, is because as people of color, there are these societal expectations, there are familial expectations, self expectations, where we always have to be kind of buttoned up, strong, and we're not talking about our mental health, we're not talking about our substance use, we're not talking about our suicidal ideations, we're not talking about these things, right? And we're isolating. And I think that's a dire place to be coming from. So the question that I ask most of my guests is, you know, in your days where you were struggling the most and they were the darkest of your days, how would those who were closest to you have known that you were struggling without you explicitly telling them so? So I know, for example, in your situation, your mother obviously was tuned in. But how was she tuned in without you saying, "Hey, ma, I got a real issue here that I think I need to address."
Hmm. I think that she wasn't afraid of the discomfort of being wrong or of my response or caught up. Sometimes we can overthink it, like, oh, I want to say something to that person, but I'm not sure if they're, again, the overthinking instead of just making that gesture. And I think that sometimes our own discomfort, we project that onto someone else. Oh, well, they probably don't want to talk about it. They probably, we kind of just find a way to dismiss it to get ourselves out of having to like have a hard conversation or something like that. And
Yeah,
so I would often say, even trying to look for a sign, sometimes it's an intuitive feeling of, this is my friend. This is my friend. This is my brother. This is my sister. This is my, whoever to you, you're in relationship with them, trust that energetic flow that you have from them. A lot of times we can tell if we allow ourselves to think about it and actually sit with the discomfort of, I know there's something wrong here, it's really, we don't need an extra sign. You know what I'm saying? Maybe they
yeah,
stumble, maybe their gait's different, maybe their breath smells like alcohol, maybe, but from a relational standpoint, a lot of times we just know and trust that knowing a little bit more. That if you're off, then you're just off. But chances
yeah,
are, if you're feeling like I should probably check in with them, or they didn't seem too well in the eyes last time, that doesn't have to be like a, intoxicated eye thing. It could just be a sadness, or a change in their and change in the ways that you know them to be from the history you have with them. And
yeah,
so I'm going to go off of like an intuitive guidance here. The signs there could be all kinds of signs. There could be no signs. But if you feel like you want to check in on somebody, lean into that hard conversation and just allow it to be awkward and uncomfortable. Just let it be
yeah.
uncomfortable. You know, whether they
So
take,
hard to do.
it's hard to do, it's so hard to do. But that I find, instead of getting caught up with, like, I've had a recent conversation with someone where they kind of watched an addiction progress from a ways away. And this is no judgment, we're all just trying to figure it out. But now that it's progressing, they can go back and say, you know what, there was time 2 years ago where I thought,
Hmm.
and then I wasn't sure, And then now it's been 6 months, and then now I'm not sure, that sort of thing. And it's just like, go with that feeling. Go with that feeling. It doesn't have to be sitting down with an intervention and a therapist in the room to address something. It could just be a nudge of, hey, I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to check in with you. I hadn't heard from you in a while. That's an open door. Doesn't have to be
Yeah.
rehearsed. It doesn't have to be like overly planned out. Um, but you can open that door with just the gesture.
Yeah. I mean, the intuition is certainly worth the exploration. I think that that's super, super valuable. Kristen, where can folks find you so that they can learn more of your methods and your approach to life just generally? Would love to make sure that we let people know.
Sure, sure. So the best way to find me on socials is at Kristen Feemster. That is my Instagram handle. If you go there, you'll see all of the content I post, but also be able to hit the link in my bio and get a drop down of different resources that I have, including my website, other podcasts. This podcast will be on there, all the things. Um, and if not on social media, my website is b3bykristen.com. That's where you can find my therapy resources, which I can provide in the state of North Carolina. And you can also find access to my wellness programs, which I offer workout programs for beginners, people who are just trying to find a rhythm and don't need anything too crazy and just need a soft place to get started. That's the type of environment that I lead with, as I'm just wanting people to be well. We're not training for body competitions here. We just want to kind of get in a good routine. So I have programs for that. And I also have a B3 community, which is a community based environment where I offer wellness courses. We do monthly challenges around healthy habit building, and really just a hub of women that are all doing the same thing together. And so all of that can be found at b3bykristen.com.
I love that. You know, we're in such a polarizing time in our history right now, and I feel like finding spaces that we can step into that help us navigate the polarity and a lot of the challenges that we're facing. I mean, especially in North Carolina. I mean, with everything that's been going on, recently there. Shout out and condolences to all the folks who are
Hmm.
struggling with the catastrophes, but we're in interesting times. So, Kristen, thank you so much for the work that you do, and continue to be a light for folks around you. If anyone's looking for that light, please go ahead and check out the show notes and follow Kristen. Thank you so much for coming on Stacking Days and sharing your journey and all the resources that you have. I really do appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Okay, awesome. Everyone, we'll be back next week, same time, same place, with more Stacking Days. And until then, please be well, one day at a time. Peace. I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days, or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices and healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.